Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 49 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Arizona Coyotes, in which the Sharks have won 4-2. And I should mention this now, clarify it. A couple of reviews ago, I had mentioned that these two games against the Arizona Coyotes were absolute must-wins for the Sharks if they wanted a chance to still be able to make the playoffs. And in the end, the Sharks actually got both of these wins and in regulation. And as such, they find themselves just 2 points behind the Arizona Coyotes. However, that is for 5th place in the West Division. What was unforeseen by me was that the St. Louis Blues would not only win one game against the Avalanche, but both games against the Avalanche, plus winners tonight here against the Minnesota Wild. As such, the Blues find themselves a full 5 points ahead of the San Jose Sharks with still 2 games in hand. And considering the fact that the Sharks now have their upcoming 4 games against the Colorado Avalanche, we may not be celebrating another Sharks victory for about a week or so, and at that point the Blues will likely pull way too far ahead. And as such, I still don't think the Sharks are really in any chance of being able to make the playoffs at this point this season. But back to the game, this one starts off quite well for the Sharks, as did the previous game. They once again score quite early on. It's Evander Kane off of a nice tic-tac-toe play from his line mates. Hurdle feeds Barabanov, who feeds Evander Kane, who puts it in to a pretty much empty net after the Coyotes just kind of looked lost on this passing play. The Sharks would then add to the lead with a nice move by Rudolf Balcers and then a Kevin Labanc goal to make it 3-0 rather early on in this first period. However, as the previous game went as well, the Coyotes would not go gentle into that good night, and they would make this game interesting rather quickly. Phil Kessel, before the end of the first period, would get a goal back on a delayed penalty, and to make it 3-1 at the end of the first period. In the second period, early on, it would be Larson who would score, and we'd have a 3-2 game. For the rest of the second period, the Sharks would bend somewhat, but they would not break, and as such, they would take a 1-goal lead into the second intermission. Come the third period, the Sharks managed to take back control of this game, and it was honestly a very solid third period that didn't necessarily give the Coyotes all too many chances to be able to tie up this game. It all culminated in the last couple of minutes to a penalty taken from Ekman Larsson. He heads to the penalty box, and then the refs realized that they made a horrible mistake calling a penalty on the team who was down 1 goal, and so they rectify it by calling a phantom penalty onto Erik Karlsson to make it 4-on-4. But even with that 4-on-4, and I guess 5-on-4 with the goaltender pulled for the Arizona Coyotes, the Sharks managed to maintain puck possession for most of those last minute or so and get an empty netter from themselves from Tomas Hertl to win the game 4-2. First thing to talk about would be Koshinash, as he gets the call here tonight for a second straight game, which wasn't necessarily all that surprising. While Koshinash wasn't particularly good in that first game a couple days ago against the Arizona Coyotes, considering these last few games are definitely a shot to try and give some of these younger players a chance to play. At least from Bob Booner's perspective, it's not too surprising that Martin Jones isn't necessarily put back in net here tonight. When it comes to the next game, actually coming up on Friday, and then on Saturday it's going to be a back-to-back, it is very possible that we do see 2 different goaltenders play those 2 back-to-back games. However, those 2 goaltenders may very well not be Jones and Koshinash, but it could actually end up being Koshinash and Melnichuk, who may very well get called up to play in a game here this season. I mean, it is expected he will play at least 1 game this season, and that could definitely be a good candidate for that. I suspect we will see Jones at some point again this season, but the question could be when. Now, back to Koshinash and how he performed here tonight. He was significantly better than he was in the previous game. He looked a lot more solid, a lot less shaky. He didn't have too much of a chance on either of these 2 Coyotes goals. The Kessel one was kind of a breakdown in coverage, as a lot of the Sharks players were kind of scrambling to be able to touch this puck to get the call on the penalty. As I said, it was a delayed penalty against the San Jose Sharks, so Erik Karlsson kind of put himself out of position on this one. And on the second goal, it was a bit of an unlucky bounce. It goes off of the stick of Tomas Hertl straight to Larson, and while this one goes through the 5-hole of Koshinash, and that never really looks good from an outside perspective. In this situation, it's a lot more understandable, as Koshinash is attempting to slide across the crease to cover Larson off of a cross crease pass that should have never been able to be completed, but was because of this unlucky bounce off of the stick of Hertl, and so didn't have too much of a chance on that one either. Otherwise, Koshinash was solid in tonight's game, and as such, it feels like a much more proud win for him from his part compared to the previous game, which was his first NHL win, but was kind of diminished by the fact that it wasn't necessarily a great game. Here tonight felt like his first real stamp on the NHL. Next, I'll be talking about Rudolf Balcers. He just continues to be a very solid player for the San Jose Sharks. Now, I guess you could say it's technically the first line, but maybe you could consider it the second line. I don't know what you could say, but he's playing with Logan Couture, and here tonight he's also playing with John Leonard as Timo Meier was demoted to the fourth line for tonight's game with Marlowe and Blickfeld, which was somewhat surprising. But Balcers had some nice moves. It wasn't a dominant performance from Balcers by any means, but he has the good move that leads to this second goal for the San Jose Sharks. He has a nice move that actually forces Ekman Larsson to take that trip late in the game that would put the Sharks in an advantageous position, if not for that phantom call at the end. And so just in general, Balcers, maybe he looked at what Barabanov did in the previous game and he says, whoa, I need to be the best newcomer on the San Jose Sharks this season, and decides to step up because while Barabanov was still good here tonight, maybe you could say Balcers edged him out in that regard. So both of these players, absolutely, Balcers and Barabanov, the Sharks should try and look to retain the rights of, because they have both looked quite solid in teal. Barabanov has had a much smaller sample size, but Balcers, it's been the case here now for a couple of months that he's been a very, very effective forward for the Sharks. Next, I'll be talking about Alex True. This is not technically his debut this season, as he has already played one game, but he's called back up and he hasn't played in a long while. And let's start with the good, of course, was this very nice pass to Kevin Labanc for the third goal of this game from the San Jose Sharks. However, that's kind of where the good parts for Alex True actually come to an end. Otherwise, there was a bit of a struggle this game. You know, he's not necessarily a super fast player. He's not necessarily a super skilled player. His defensive game is not terrible, as he did get some penalty kill time here tonight, but it also isn't anything that blows you away as a third or fourth line center, as you're supposed to be when you want to be an effective third or fourth line center at the NHL level. And so I wasn't necessarily particularly impressed with Alex True's game here tonight, and so I wouldn't be surprised if he's sent back to the AHL for the following game when we see a few different names from the San Jose Sharks in the forward lineup. And finally, let's talk about Pasichnuk, as unlike Alex True, this actually was his debut game, not only on the season, but also for his NHL career. The San Jose Sharks signed him out of college during this past offseason, and he gets a chance here tonight in place of Greg Pateryn. As I mentioned for Greg Pateryn, those past couple of games were very, very effective for him, so I suspect, and I will say yes, that this benching for him, if you could really call it that, is definitely not indicative of how Pateryn has performed in these past couple of games, and is likely just a consequence of the fact that the Sharks want to give some good looks to some of their younger defensemen to see what they have going for them going into the following season and into the future. And Pasichnuk here tonight, it was not great, to say the least. There were a couple of nice plays, I guess you could say, but there were also times where he kind of scrambled a bit in his own defensive zone, and in the end, when it came to the third period and the Sharks were up a goal and trying to hold on to that precarious 1-goal lead, Bob Booner did what he normally does and shortened the bench, and Pasichnuk was a victim of that situation. I don't know if he even got a single shift in that third period. And so he only ends up with about 8.5 minutes, which, to put it into perspective with some of the other Sharks' 6 defensemen, to put into perspective with what Greg Pateryn had gotten in the past couple of games, that is almost just over half of what Pateryn was getting over the past couple of games. So not a fantastic debut from Pasichnuk, but I guess it wasn't necessarily all that bad. Will we see another game from Pasichnuk here this season? It's technically possible, but for the next game, we may also see another new face into the lineup. Will we may potentially see Ryan Merkley get called up and get his first NHL game? It could definitely happen. The fact that the upcoming game is, though, against the Colorado Avalanche, who are a very offensively gifted team, you may not want to get a player like Ryan Merkley up into your lineup for a game like that, against a team like that, because maybe you don't want to hurt his confidence all too much. So it's also possible that we see Greg Pateryn back in the lineup, or maybe even Radim Shemek, depending on how his injury is progressing for that game on Friday. But, anything is possible, and it definitely wouldn't surprise me if Merkley gets at least one game between now and the end of the year. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday. They will take on the Colorado Avalanche, an extremely strong team in the West Division, who are actually coming in on a bit of a losing streak for themselves. Not only did they lose both of those games to the St. Louis Blues, as I mentioned earlier, but they were also losers here tonight against the Vegas Golden Knights. So the Avalanche are coming in with a losing streak. The Sharks are going to be coming in with a bit of a winning streak for themselves. And, well, I honestly don't know how well it's going to go for the Sharks. We might be, as I said earlier, not be celebrating a Sharks victory for a few days now. Class dismissed.